My name is Jason Brashatsky. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations at Mercersburg. This is interesting. This is my 23rd year at the school. Before joining the alumni office, I taught math here for 18 years. And, it's been awesome always to, get to meet alumni at events. And I've always been just so inspired by the way that we've come together. And I think now more than ever, it's been unbelievably inspiring the way that people are kind of connecting at this difficult time. And I think at a time when people need to connect probably more than ever. And so I appreciate all of you guys coming in and taking the time to join us for this session tonight. So thank you for coming, and a special thank you, obviously, to Maureen for agreeing to share her work and her story. Maureen is originally from Glenside, Pennsylvania, and she was a 4-year student at Mercersburg. When she was at Mercersburg, she was a member of the 15, a Writing Center associate, a prefect in Tippett. She coordinated the chapel nursery, was a member of the lacrosse team, and was part of the Cum Laude Society. Maureen attended Swarthmore College, where she majored in linguistics with minors in English literature and peace and conflict studies. Her undergraduate thesis on the use of contentious place names in Northern Ireland was published in a Journal of Irish Studies. Currently, Maureen works as a museum educator at the National Liberty Museum in Philadelphia. She performs outreach education at Title I schools in the Philadelphia area through the Young Heroes Outreach Program, a civics and character-based education program that aims to inspire students in grades 4 to 8 to identify social issues affecting their communities and to address them through student-led social action projects. She recently graduated from Villanova with a master's in liberal studies, and her coursework focused on the interaction between history and memory, especially in the cases of conflict and violence. Her thesis, which forms the basis of this presentation today, examined the role of U.S. history education, the role that U.S. history education plays in creating racial justice and the benefits of viewing racial justice through the lens of transitional justice. In recognition of Mercersburg's 50 years of co-education, this program is part of the WeSpeak series. This series is encouraging discussions of gender equity in today's society. And today she's speaking about the role that education can play in transforming social conflict. We will be recording this session to make it available to people that were not able to make it. Best practices for these sessions have been to mute your microphone. I'll be monitoring the chat window, so please feel free to use it. Following her talk, Maureen's going to open it up to more discussion. Maureen, I'm going to hand it over to you, but thanks again for joining us, to everyone.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'm going to go right ahead and get started. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. While I'm doing that, if everybody who has been able to attend wants to just say what brought them to this session, just so I get an idea of what people's interests are. If you don't want to share with the group while you're here, feel free to send me a private message through the chat. That should be a feature you can make use of now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so in case anybody has forgotten what they signed up for, here is the blurb that got you all here. And I want to take this moment to highlight for your attention 2 parts that are important here. And that would be the terms historical injustices and the term transitional justice. This will give everybody a quick debrief on kind of what I'll be talking about. And for any of you who realize you are in the wrong session, this is a great time for you to exit gracefully. So in terms of historical injustices, what I'm thinking of as historical injustices here are things that are specifically identity-based. So any type of injustice that has been perpetrated because of an identity marker like race, gender, sex, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, and even in some case politics, if it has become something that has been seen as immutable. those are all what I would be defining as identity markers. The other thing that is important for my definition of historical injustice would be any type of injustice that is state sanctioned. Now that can be at the level of sort of federal state sanctions or repression, or it can be anything, any sort of law or political reality that keeps equality from being given to all. So obviously today, since we're talking about gender discrimination and sex discrimination, I will be thinking about those two things in these terms. So for historical injustices throughout time for women in the United States, for example, we can think of easy ones like voting, for example. So obviously waiting for the 19th Amendment for all women to have the right to vote. Throughout the United States would be one example of a historical injustice based on this definition. Identity marker is obviously sex. It is state sanctioned. Other examples could be things like coverture laws. So the fact that married women had to give up their claims to property and instead give them to their husbands, things like that. So moving right along, we get into the idea of transitional justice. So transitional justice finds its origins actually in the Nuremberg trials, as well as the democratic transitions that Latin America went through in the 1980s. So here the transition in transitional justice actually comes from this idea of transitioning from an authoritarian regime to a democracy. Nowadays in the literature, a lot of times when we're talking about transitional justice, we actually use a revised interpretation. We're thinking more of transitioning from a rights abusing state to a rights respecting one. So under this definition, it doesn't matter so much whether it was an authoritarian regime that was repressing people's rights. It just matters if it was sort of an authoritarian ethos. So for example, the United States, despite being a democracy, obviously curtailed the rights of African Americans throughout history. And so we would see the transition for the United States in these terms start with, say, the 13th and 15th Amendments as they started to expand the rights that were being offered to others. Another important facet of transitional justice is the fact that it's seen as being Janus-based. And what that means is basically it looks backwards and forwards. So on the one hand, it acknowledges the wrongfulness of the past. So it emphasizes the fact that we need to look to recognize the acts that have been perpetrated in the past, especially acts that were perpetrated in the name of the state or a polity. But specifically, looking at these more backward facing aspects is done for the future. So we're not trying to redress past grievances just for the sake of doing that or for admitting that we were wrong. It's specifically so that we can reestablish, or in some cases establish for the first time, rights respecting relationships for the present and the future. So then we get to America itself. So America is kind of paradoxical when it comes to our relationship with civil rights. So on the one hand, we define ourselves by a mythic commitment to liberty, right? We're the land of the free, home of the brave. And so given our pride that comes from being this land of the free, it's embarrassing, guilt-producing, and disillusioning to be faced with this reality of state-sanctioned civil rights abuses throughout U.S. history, both racially, in terms of gender, in terms of sexual orientation, anything where it has been shown that we have not actually lived up to that ideal. It makes us pretty uncomfortable to talk about, both on a societal level and especially in the classroom. And so that causes a big problem for us. So we tend to focus on the narratives that we can be proud of and not the ones that, you know, cast us in a hypocritical light. And then finally, education's role in social conflict. Theorists talk about the role of education constantly when it comes to societal conflict. On the one hand, it can be seen as divisive, especially when we talk about this idea of like a master narrative, for example. So people in power are usually in control of state curriculum. And so this would be like things like stories of predominantly white men being in most history curricula throughout the country, because those are the stories that we know best. The groups in power are represented in favorable ways in those curricula. And so education can continue to propagate societal divides. However, we also see a lot of literature that suggests that education can be reconciliatory. So it can promote social cohesion, it can promote tolerance, and it can promote peace building. And a lot of times when we focus on this sort of social cohesion and tolerance aspect, we're thinking specifically of peace building across citizens rather than between citizens and institutions, for example. And that's kind of how a transitional justice framework can help here. So in transitional justice, the idea is to build trust amongst citizens themselves, but also between the minority citizens or underrepresented citizens historically and the institutions of the state. And the reason this is so important goes back to that idea of historical injustices being specifically things that were sanctioned by the state or sanctioned by governments that are meant to be protecting us, right? There's a certain fundamental lack of trust that happens when you realize that historically you have not been treated as equally as other people have been treated. And so we can see that feeling of distrust manifest itself in a lot of different types of efforts that are found globally in transitional justice dialogues. So these are things like truth and reconciliation commissions, public apologies, and even criminal proceedings. And the thing that all of these efforts have in common is they're meant to reassure previously marginalized citizens that there is a shared set of norms that everyone ascribes to that will protect legally and politically the rights that were previously not granted. The other important piece in looking through a transitional justice framework is that it sort of catalyzes history education as a form of official acknowledgement itself. So if we're saying that one of the things that transitional justice efforts aim to do is to have some sort of official acknowledgement, that backwards facing piece of bringing light to the historical injustices that have been faced by various groups. Education, specifically public education, acts as a means of becoming an official apology because the school itself and the teachers by proxy carry the weight of the state or the authority of the state behind them. So as a mechanism of the state, having a curriculum that acknowledges past injustices actually signals trustworthiness of state institutions because it acknowledges the past harm, and that suggests that there is a new rights respecting norm. So we're not just saying, oh, we did this bad thing, we're saying we did this bad thing and we recognize that it went against the rights that we were supposed to be respecting, and obviously we will not do that in the future. This is important even for non-public schools because this type of acknowledgement suggests sort of a trustworthiness of society at large, and especially in times where there is so much division societally and so many feelings of distrust from previously and to this day marginalized groups, it's important to have that kind of reconciliation with the state at a cultural level. And then finally, the important piece of looking through a transitional justice framework for this is, especially in education and classrooms, there is a wealth of information that exists beyond the borders of our country. There have been many efforts to reform education, to cast a more critical eye, especially racial theory, critical theory, and there are amazing attempts to try to combat the continued silence that often surrounds these issues in education. However, if you look at a broader global frame, you'll find that there are many other countries that also have quite deep roots of identity-based conflicts, and especially ones that involve state-sanctioned repression. And many of these countries have been held accountable in ways that the United States has not. So in part due to the fact that the United States is one of the more politically powerful countries and has been, we have not really been held to account by our international neighbors to actually try to redress any of these grievances. And that's usually when most change happens. So other countries like, for example, Northern Ireland, Germany, South Africa, other Western countries had basically said that they needed to make vast efforts to somehow reconcile with their past history of rights abusing norms. And one of the first things that many of these countries did was to look at their education curricula and say, how do we promote peace and reconciliation, specifically targeting this identity-based conflict and the stereotypes that went along with it in order to foster peace at a societal level. So since we in the United States don't generally see ourselves through a transitional justice framework, we haven't always used all of the information that is available to try and make decisions about how we will continue to reform education to promote social justice here, which is a shame, especially since history education can play such a crucial role in societies that are in post-conflict settings. So, that having been said, now we're going to talk a little bit about the guidelines for teaching about historical injustices. So in my research, I did a vast literature review looking for instances of best practices, shortcomings, etc., for countries that had similarly had experienced widespread social conflict that was ingrained sort of within the fabric of society itself. And so all of there will be, I think, 6 or 7 recommendations here that all come from that literature. And the first one is pretty obvious, actually. Engage with difficult knowledge explicitly or engage with it directly. So difficult knowledge here is both anything that could be sensitive to talk about. Like I said, in America, since we often see ourselves as being a bastion of liberty, it's really uncomfortable to have to admit that liberty has not always been the rallying cry we like to think of it as, at least not for many people throughout our history. The other reason that this knowledge can be seen as difficult is because a lot of the narratives that surround these types of histories are very common. We learn very similar things about it throughout time. There are sort of standard narratives that we get. And oftentimes there are certain aspects to those histories that are missing. And so it can be difficult to reconcile new information that has been gleaned through research, especially research into, for example, African American and women's contributions over time, to be able to reconcile that with these ideas that we have of how history has unfolded in this country in general. So the first thing is to engage with this directly. And so part of this is important because if we're not talking about these issues in classrooms, it's not that it won't be talked about at all. It will actually be taught through other mediums, less critical mediums usually. So maybe books and films, family and community histories, museums, or any other sort of form of collective memory. And sometimes that's not to say that these forms of societal collective memory are bad necessarily, but oftentimes they are uncritical. So if anybody has ever seen any films dramatizing aspects of World War II, we wouldn't necessarily want to take a test on World War II history based just off of what we learned from that. And so it's really important that in the classrooms we're engaging in these same narratives in order to offer a critical eye, to use historical analysis and interpretation to sort of get to the truth of the matter, or to be able to come up with our own truths about it, rather than just receiving information from sometimes invalid sources. The other issue here is that even if we are talking about these issues in classrooms, as I said, they can be very difficult to address. And so one of the things that is so important is not just whether difficult histories are taught, but also how they are being taught. And so that gets us into the next part of the recommendations. So one of the big ones is incorporating something called multiperspectivity. Now, unsurprisingly, multiperspectivity, which is just a big fancy word for no reason, it does involve multiple perspectives. So recognizing that different people throughout history and even in our current time will give different testimonies as to what is going on. And so understanding that there are multiple perspectives to the same event is very important. And obviously, highlighting voices that have previously been silenced is a huge part of this. But it also includes understanding that there can be more than one historical truth. And in fact, there is always more than one historical truth. So, as I said, people can witness the same event and have very different feelings about it. It can affect them in very different ways. Just because those effects are different and in some case contradictory does not invalidate either of the truths that those people have experienced. It just means that we have to complicate our idea of sort of a simple historical narrative and look more at history as a form of production or interpretation. So instead of seeing it as an array of facts that is laid out in a way that suggests no sort of outside subjective interpretation has come to it, we have to understand that all of it has been analyzed and produced in a way that has some sort of bias to it. So on the theme of complicating the history as we understand it, another thing that is really important within the literature on transitional justice for societies that have experienced identity-based conflict is problematizing easy binaries. So, for example, oftentimes what will happen in places that have experienced conflict is that there will be identity becomes this rigid categorization. It's something you can't escape. It's seen as something that is immutable. So the issue here is that beyond just a very strict, oftentimes arbitrary boundary. So for example, for African Americans in the United States, right, we had some ridiculous fraction of amount of blood that would make you seen as African American. But they're held as being completely immutable. Once you are put into that category, you are stuck there, essentially. A larger issue that plays into this is that oftentimes when you have these types of constructed binary identities, what happens is that legal, social, political, and historical realities collapse. And so there's this impression that people who belong to this constructed group all have the same thoughts, the same opinions. They're all fundamentally kind of the same. And that makes it really difficult to have conversations and dialogues that will allow people to move forward. So one of the main aspects here is disrupting these types of essentialized identity categories. So instead of thinking in terms of African Americans and whites, for example, or men and women, we think of the in-betweens, right? So in my research, it focused specifically on the fact that, for example, you can have people of mixed race. They exist. Oftentimes they're not represented in a lot of the literature. In history education, for example, they're often forgotten about in these easier to process narratives that pit one race against another throughout history. What it also does is it allows the opportunity to focus on the differences that exist within those groups. So again, not every African American would have had the same experience throughout history. This is something that we sort of immediately understand when it comes to the white perspective in this country, because we see people of very different backgrounds being portrayed in different ways with different thoughts. There's a lot of room for variation when it comes to the white experience, but we all, especially the white male experience, but we don't always allow those same types of variations for marginalized groups throughout history and in the current day. So part of this is understanding that identity itself is actually very multifaceted, right? Your gender doesn't make you who you are. Your race doesn't make you who you are. Your political opinions don't make you who you are. All of these things coalesce together to create who you are as a person, to create your identity. And these things are actually quite fluid. So even each one of us here, our identity has not been consistent from the time that we were born to now. We've gone through changes. We may change how we define ourselves in many ways. And sometimes how we identify ourselves will particularly depend on the other people we are with. So for example, if I am with a group of white females, I probably don't prioritize the fact that I am a white female. The thing that would differentiate me might be that I love libraries or that I work at a museum. Those are also aspects of my identity. And they're given relative weight and importance based on how society views me and also the society that I am in at the time and my views on it. Another guideline that comes up constantly in this literature is the importance of incorporating new knowledge. So for example, here new really just means, and this is getting back to something that I had mentioned before, which is that a lot of the narratives that we get when looking at history, especially history that is laden with some sort of moral component, so things that involve historical injustices usually, is that we hear sort of the same thing over and over again. So for example, when we're talking about women's rights, what we will often hear about is, you know, the importance of the 19th Amendment being passed and the fact women didn't have the right to vote. And so what can sometimes happen in these situations where, especially groups who have historically held power hear these narratives over and over again, there can be a lot of resistance that comes from that, because the idea becomes that learning history has moved from being a process of actual historical analysis and transmitting historical information. It is instead sort of a morality tale. And so there's a fatigue that comes with it. And this is actually pretty consistent throughout the literature. So for example, in South Africa, even students who identify as Black were talking about the fact that they were sick of learning the history of apartheid. And in part because it also re-victimizes previously marginalized groups by casting everybody into the role of a historical victim, essentially. And so this can be extremely problematic. So in incorporating new knowledge, one of the things that the focus is on is actually finding new ways to tell narratives, or finding new aspects to, again, sort of complicate that type of history. So instead of continuing with preconceived notions of how things happened, for example, with the 19th Amendment, maybe one of the things that you would teach about is the fact that women actually did have the right to vote in a number of states. So for example, New Jersey before 1807, women were able to vote up until the point where they were married. And in 1807, they changed the laws to say that it was only free white men who would be able to do it. That's a history that is often overlooked. We often think of women in terms of never being able to vote up until the 19th Amendment is passed. And it's not just historically untrue. It also sort of gives us this idea that one day things just changed and that change is kind of immutable. And that's obviously quite problematic. The other aspect of incorporating new knowledge is sometimes the shock value of understanding something that you didn't before is far more powerful actually than trying to retell the same story again. So for example, many people in my generation are unaware of the fact that women in the 1970s needed a man to co-sign for a credit card. And this was something in their daily lives that would have affected them. It was specifically based off of preconceived ideas of their gender, of their sex. And it's a hugely problematic thing to overlook. We often think about women's issues as being something that were historical and are now no longer a problem, but understanding that there is more than just this one narrative. There's more than Susan B. Anthony, for example, is very important. Another thing that becomes really important in these narratives is highlighting the continuity between past and present. So oftentimes we have a tendency to divorce the past and the present. We think, as I said, that things inevitably happened the way that they did. And there's sort of this idea that there's no agency. Students feel that the past is completely divorced from what's happening now. They don't see how it has an effect. And part of that problem means that people aren't able to look at the social and institutional forces that have been acting on us throughout time. The choices that we have made have made these changes. And part of that is problematic, obviously, because we need to understand these constructs in general. But it's also problematic because it makes us feel like there's nothing that we can do about it. Today is today because it just happened that way. Nothing shaped it. It just is what it is. This is particularly problematic in the United States, actually, because research suggests that children in America often view changing ideas on discrimination throughout US history not as a process that was filled with activism and hard work. It's often actually viewed as something that just was simply a revelation or a societal epiphany. Like all of a sudden, everybody just suddenly realized that women and African Americans should be treated equally to white men. And that's hugely problematic for today's society because we want to have, especially through history education in a democracy, it's important that students are not only educated on issues, but that they also understand the democratic process is something that gives them the agency to make changes in their world. Those who show up are the ones who make the rules. And so having this idea that there is nothing that can change the trajectory of the future because nothing has changed the past to become the present, it becomes very problematic in these contexts. And then finally, the last suggestion in the literature is that we use a human and civil rights oriented lens when we're talking about any sort of historical injustices. So not just focusing on sort of the sympathetic response or the emotionally based response of the sort of morality tale of obviously it is horrible to treat another person and to view another person as property, for example, because of the idea of human dignity, but also, again, getting back to that idea of a state is meant to protect its citizens. If that protection is not being offered, then that means that the state is, in fact, going against what it has promised. And so making this dialogue not just about treatment in terms of sort of a social emotional response, like treat people fairly, treat people justly, but actually thinking about it in terms of legal and political designations becomes vastly important because, again, if we think of transitional justice as something that is forward-facing in the sense of trying to look at how past injustices and past rights abuses have been perpetrated, to acknowledge them in order to try and establish new norms for the future where rights will be respected, then it has to be clear why this is a problem, right? It can't just be that this was wrong. It has to be these rights were not being protected. And so in the future, because these people are equally citizens and they should have equal trust in our institutions, we have to name it in this dialogue. So that is what I have for you all today. Those are the guidelines that have come through my research. As I said, the original research was based on racial discrimination throughout time. And now it has shifted slightly to talk about gender discrimination. But please feel free to let me know what questions you have. Obviously, I can answer more when it comes to racial discrimination, but we can always theorize about how this plays into gender and sex discrimination. If you have any questions about transitional justice, peace and conflict studies with relation to education, I'm happy to answer anything. Or if you have any clarifying questions, which is also very possible.
Maureen, can you actually go, because I know can you go back to the slide about the Janus perspective and maybe kind of go over that again? You know,
Sure.
That's something that I think about, it's hard not to have white guilt.
Hmm. Yeah, so we're talking about this sort of backwards and forwards facing perspective. Part of that is actually, it dovetails quite nicely into your point about sort of feeling white guilt, right? So part of the issue is that when you're consistently told narratives that cast sort of the group that you are ascribed to in a negative light, one of the main, or there are a couple of main reactions, right? One of them is defensiveness, usually to the point of aggressiveness. Another one is this feeling of guilt. And part of what guilt is, right, is the idea that something has happened in the past that is now unchangeable, right? So we are theoretically being held accountable for something that we didn't have any part in, but because we share physical identity characteristics with the group that had been empowered to do it, and because we often are tacitly supporting those power structures today, you're left with this feeling of overwhelming guilt. Something bad has happened. You are somehow involved, but it feels like there's no way to change it. That's the issue with looking at just the backwards facing lens, just at what had happened. The important part in looking forward is that it actually does give you some sort of agency to be able to create change. So you recognize that there's a problem, but you also have the opportunity to try and not solve that problem in the past, obviously, but to make sure that that problem stops for the future, that you are actively participating to make sure that the rights that have been restricted previously are no longer going to be able to. And so getting rid of that sort of sense of fatalism in some ways can really help, especially students, to think of how they can make a difference in the world, right? It's never fun to find out that there is a problem that happened in the past that you can't solve. But if there's an opportunity to fix it in the future, even on sort of a personal level, it's often easier for us to reconcile that than it is to be told that you've done something that caused some sort of damage and that there's just nothing to be done for it now.
So
Does that answer your question?
I had a somewhat follow up on that, if that's all right, Jason.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Maureen, of course.
Yeah, go for it.
So, kind of tying into one of your last points with that issue of kind of the past and forward issue, with the pedagogy of teaching students, I think, from more disadvantaged communities that may still find themselves in maybe less disadvantaged, but disadvantaged communities all the same. What is the, I guess, approach to teaching, and this is to pick an example, like for racial basis, like African American communities where you have, 400 years of just abominable government behavior and societal behavior that for some of these kids may not be different in terms of police brutality or other racial disparities they're still suffering. How is there an approach that is different for people that are still kind of in those things to, I mean, I kind of get to the idea of hopelessness, but that's not what I want. But what's the approach to that?
So I think part of the issue, right, is that the reason that these issues still persist in our society, even if we're thinking about specific communities, right, who might experience the impacts of it more harshly or more acutely, rather, we are all still part of the same society in terms of the nation, and the nation that is allowing these things to happen, right? So it is something that affects all of the communities, just not in the same way. Some are affected disproportionately by the impacts. Part of the problem with that is that people who are in a more privileged stance oftentimes are able to, again, overlook the relationship between past civil rights abuses and current civil rights abuses. So in not being able to see that thread, so for example, for racial discrimination, right, the issue isn't just the particular manifestations of racial discrimination that cropped up, like Jim Crow laws, which existed both in the North and the South, despite the fact we only really talk about them as a Southern institution. It's also the ideology and violence of white supremacy that founded all of them, that kind of created those manifestations. So in looking at the history of white supremacy, which again is like a construct that was created, it allows you to sort of follow that thread from past to present to see that that's still an issue in our society today, and that many of the aspects of our society are still still very much based in white supremacy, which is why there's so much discussion about the need to sort of target that first. So in opening these discussions up into areas that are privileged enough to not feel these impacts, hopefully that also helps people to take more agency to be able to make changes and see themselves as active participants in a democracy in which they can change to a more rights respecting norm and ask for the changes to be made since they have more political power. I would say in terms of like some of the schools that I work in, for example, I can see where there would be a feeling of hopelessness, but it's also important to acknowledge that in many of the schools, these narratives still aren't being taught. And so it's something that these kids sort of know fundamentally is unfair. But all of the institutional knowledge that they are gaining is acting like this isn't a problem. It's being ignored. And so there's a certain validation that comes with having somebody acknowledge what you have experienced. And I think that's true for kids too. So even though they may not feel as fundamentally empowered as people who have sort of more political cachet, for example, especially when you're talking about kids, right? Because besides any other fundamental issues in political power that might exist from an identity-based level, like being a child in a democracy, you don't really get the same say as an adult. Being able to at least have these open discussions and talk about the role that agency plays in allowing change to occur can be very empowering. So did that answer your question?
No, I think that
No,
not
it
only
didn't.
answered the question, but maybe even follow-ups or other issues that I hadn't considered. So that's really the best kind of answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maureen,
Yes.
thank you so much for doing this. And I'm so sorry that we're not here in person, or we were in person last month. But I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your personal story and what drew you to this area of study. And I appreciate your passion about it. I'd like to hear a little bit more.
Sure. So I actually was drawn to this area of study, particularly because, I mean, conflict is something that is inevitable in the human experience, whether that's interpersonal conflict, if it's conflict on a national or global scale, like a societal scale. It's something that we often think of conflict as being fundamentally negative or violent, but that's not the case. We only really think about conflict in those terms because when it escalates, because there weren't productive or constructive processes to deal with it, it escalates. And that's where things become a problem. So the idea of how do you deal with conflict in a way that is productive and constructive is something that's really important. What processes or mechanisms, especially at a societal level, do you put in place to make sure that vastly different groups of people get along is fundamental to the question of democracy, for example, right? The whole idea of we have all these different people who are all supposed to have an equal voice and an equal opinion. Well, that's a recipe for conflict if ever I've heard one. So that's one piece. And that's why it's really important in terms of US education, I think, to be thinking about these issues. For part of my personal story, though, my family is partially from Belfast, Northern Ireland. And so there has been an ethno-political conflict going on since the first colonization of Ulster, and kicked off with the violence of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. My family lived through that experience, is still living through that experience. And so having grown up being familiar with these stories or with these histories in sort of a community level and a familial level, when I first went there to study abroad and I was taking courses that were talking about the historical aspects and looking at it through a critical lens and a critical eye, I realized how much cultural transmission differs from sort of taking a critical look. Like the more familiar you are with a circumstance, the more blind spots you sometimes have. And so after I had taken that course, it made me think about the US and how we have very similar ideological conflicts, or rather identity-based conflicts that have been going on pretty much since we were founded. And because I have been part and parcel of the American experience since I was born, there are a lot of blind spots for me from that reason. So trying to look more critically at the situation here by using the lens of a more foreign situation, which is similar, was hugely important to me as I continued my studies in peace and conflict studies.
Thank you.
Maureen, I'll hop in really quickly here. First off, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. This is really exciting for me as a history teacher and the director of diversity, equity, inclusion at the academy. You know, I'm so excited to see that one of our alums is so engaged in the research that you know, our diversity committees are kind of working through and thinking about in terms of how this can impact how we engage with our students in our community. So I'm sure I'll get a chance to nerd out with you a little bit on
I
your
love
research.
that. Go for it.
So I won't bore everyone on the call with that. But
I mean, I already
have a
did. You might as
question
well, but continue.
I did have a question as related to kind of the idea of the trust between, you know, you kind of talked about the trust between citizens and within this reconciliation effort. I'm curious about the trust between the state and the citizen and how that is rebuilt by the state within this transitional justice framework. You know, because some of the things that you mentioned, you know, as it relates to, in some ways, kind of the illegitimacy of the state if they're not adhering to their part of the bargain, right? And you know, you mentioned the idea that true change, is something that comes through reconciliation. All of that suggests that there needs to be some type of concession by the state, right? And some actual action is necessary in order for there to be authentic trust that's built between the state and the citizens. So I'm curious to know, does the transitional justice framework allow for that? Like, is there a space that's kind of designed to create that trust, or that puts the burden on the state to work toward creating that trust?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm really glad you brought this up, actually. So for transitional justice, I think I rattled off a bunch of them earlier, but there are many mechanisms that individuals who are living in societies have had sort of grassroots efforts, but also sort of political parties that have been involved in sort of mandated peace processes have come up with to try and restore this sense of trust. That isn't to say that it's a magic pill that magically fixes everything. It usually doesn't. They can be very contentious. But things like truth and reconciliation commissions, it's something that we have actually tried in certain areas in the US. I think Greensboro, I want to say, had a truth and reconciliation commission to talk about different aspects of segregation and racial violence that had happened in that community. And because it is a community-based effort, there's a different type of buy-in that comes from that. So that would be one mechanism. Official state apologies is another mechanism that often comes up for reconciliation, because again, it involves the state admitting we did not respect these rights. We did not make good on the trust that you should have been able to instill in us to protect you legally and politically. We recognize that, and moving forward, we understand that the expectation is that that cannot happen, right? Part of the reason why I looked at education in particular for this project, along with the fact that I'm very interested in education, is actually because the United States's position politically, especially both in the sense of nationally, like our politics, as well as our politics on the international stage, makes it really hard to get traction for some of the transitional justice initiatives that have been taken overseas, because there isn't the political will for it in the United States itself, because of the fact that the majority in power is actually also a numerical majority for the most part, and that's hard in a democracy like ours. But also because, again, as a political hegemon, we haven't been held accountable the way other states have to try and redress these grievances. And so, especially with the current political climate, the odds of us having things like reparations for slavery, for example, to go back to the racial justice initiatives, or having an official state apology. I mean, there have been measures or legislation that has been put up for vote multiple times, asking for some sort of formal apology, and oftentimes it is voted down. So that official acknowledgement does not seem like it will be coming. The avenue of education, and specifically public education, is not perfect by any means. However, because teachers working in public schools are sort of part of the machine itself, the political machine, there's sort of a state official by proxy situation that sets up. So at least if schools are offering education as a form of acknowledgement of past harms and past injustices, which is a central tenet of transitional justice, it carries the state's authority, essentially. So it's not ideal, but it's really like a stepping stone, so that hopefully with more conversation, with more of a critical eye being taken to these issues, there will also be a transition to active participating citizens of the democracy who are advocating for change, because they recognize the past injustices. They want to create a more stable, protective future for all, and they will feel that they have the capacity to actually be agents of change themselves.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, hopefully that answered your question.
Oh, that actually did. I mean, I actually added notes of things to,
Oh, lovely.
to go look up later. So yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, yeah. Anybody else?
Maureen, probably somewhat connected to that. When we talked earlier this morning, you mentioned that when you started this, that you reached out to Peter Kempe, who shared with you what Germany's done, and if I understand it correctly, it's against the law to deny the Holocaust in Germany. And you mentioned apartheid in South Africa. Are there similar laws or in other countries too? For some reason I know the German one, but is that really the standard and America's missing out, or what's the general way?
So I will say, Germany, for example, is really kind of held up as the gold standard when it comes to reconciling with the past or reckoning with the past. There is a very, very long German word I'm not even going to attempt right now that specifically means to reckon with the past, with particular regards to the Holocaust. And Germany is in an interesting position because they were really, in terms of transitional justice especially, they were a state that decided to make some form of reparation to a group that did not have the political capacity to really advocate for it for themselves, or even to really have international pressure originally to be able to get any sort of reparation. And obviously it wasn't being paid to a state. And so they are yes, Dave, thank you for typing to me the German word that I still will not be able to say. But yes, now everybody else can see it at least. But yes, so the German state is often seen as having been crucial as like sort of opening the floodgates to transitional justice and what it could be. It was a very unprecedented move. And in my discussions with Mr. Kempe originally, when we were talking about it, he talked a lot about the policy that they had of just sort of opening the books, opening the historical record, and laying everything bare. And in some ways, people's worst fears come to life, right? Everybody is made to have these very difficult conversations. It can inflame tensions, but eventually it did change the sort of norms of the culture. And as you can see, there is a much sort of harsher or a much more protected sense of people's rights and like what you are able to, again, deny in this case. Like you aren't even able to deny that it happened. That is how protected even the acknowledgement or how expected it is that you must acknowledge that it is part of the historical record. And even in the States, obviously, we have many Holocaust deniers. And we have many people who will fight over the impact of racial violence throughout history. It's obviously not a norm that we have created. In other countries, there's just sort of a spectrum, as there is with most things, right? There are some countries that have made absolutely no types of amends for historical injustices. So, for example, the Armenian genocide, there has been very little that has been done to acknowledge that that ever happened. Oftentimes, the political will in that country, there's continued refutation that it ever happened, which is sort of one end of the spectrum. You have Germany on the other, and then you have sort of the in-between ones. The United States, as I said, hasn't necessarily had to grapple with too much, so we're kind of in the middle. Northern Ireland was forced to go through various peace processes that have in some ways worked, in other ways there's still a lot of hesitation to talk about community histories. There's still a lot of division. Many people do not live in the same neighborhoods. They're very segregated. And the schools themselves, since they go through religious schools for the most part, the state-run schools are predominantly Protestant. And then there are Catholic schools. There's not a lot of cohesion at the societal level. So despite the fact that transitional justice mechanisms have been put into place, even in history classes in Northern Ireland, people will often avoid talking about the troubles because it's too concerning that tensions would be raised again. Somewhere in there, hopefully there was an answer to your question, because I talked for way too long for there to have not been.
Maureen, this has been so awesome. I mean, like I do want to be mindful of people's times, and we're at 9 o'clock. But when we kind of first thought about WeSpeak and the idea of kind of creating dialogue around equity, like I can't imagine a kind of a better like example of what we were possibly hoping for. And thank you so much for kind of coming in and sharing your story and your work, and encouraging us to think differently. That's probably at the key of it all. And I know I picked up a lot, and trying to think forward and next steps, and how great kind of for Mercersburg and for society and everything. And just really appreciate your leadership here, and being willing to take the time and share with us. I would like to, if I can, I'm going to take a screenshot. And so if I could get, sometimes when we do this and I don't cue people, I get people mid-bite or something like that. So I'm going to take a quick screenshot for posterity.
Get David on here.
What's that?
Oh yeah, I can't miss Dave Hill on here.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. All right, here we go. Oh, wait, nope, it didn't take. Hold on one sec. Man, nice. All right, but this will be available on recording. It takes about a day for us to kind of get it ready for it to be through the website. And I'm going to encourage you guys to keep looking at our events program, especially for the WeSpeak series. Already scheduled on Thursday. Robert Nagel, who was class of 2008, has done a lot of work. He's got his PhD with conflict studies and kind of women's roles in conflict studies in the UN. And he's going to be doing his talk on Thursday. But we've got lots of great programming throughout, so make sure you're checking out our website. And stay safe in tough time, but certainly connections and dialogue are just what we want. So thanks so much for taking the time. I also want to make sure to recognize Jackie Grace, who's been kind of manning the Zoom call and has been really helpful with the logistics of getting this all set up also. And but Maureen, really, that was awesome. Thanks so much.
Oh no, thanks everybody for sacrificing an hour of your night. I really appreciate it. If I didn't get to anybody's questions in the comment, I know I just responded to Agnes saying she can feel free to email me because I think the chat might be disappearing soon. I know, Mr. Rashofsky, you said you would be sending out my contact information. So please, feel free to be in touch if you have any questions, either about more information that you can find, or if there was something in here that you didn't want to ask about at the moment that you didn't understand, but I went through too fast. So thanks again for coming out.
Thanks, Maureen. You did great.